The day after we buried my husband of 41 years, my daughter-in-law rearranged my kitchen. I came downstairs at 6 in the morning, the way I always do, expecting the familiar comfort of my own home. The blue ceramic mug on the second hook, the coffee filters in the drawer to the left of the stove, the small framed photo of my mother on the windowsill above the sink. Instead, I found everything shifted 3 inches to the right. The photo moved to the counter, and my daughter-in-law standing at my stove in a bathrobe that was not hers, making herself at home, in a way that made my stomach go quiet and cold. "I hope you don't mind," she said, not turning around. The flow made more sense this way. I said nothing. I poured my coffee, and I went to sit on the back porch, and I looked out at the garden my husband had spent 20 years building, and I thought, I need to be very, very careful from this point forward. My name is not important. What matters is that I am 67 years old. I taught high school English for 32 years. I raised one son mostly by myself while my husband traveled for work, and I loved that son with the kind of love you don't put into words, because words always fall short. His name is, well, I will call him my son. That is enough. He is a good man in many ways. He was raised to be kind. I still believe that. But grief does strange things to people, and so does money, and sometimes the people closest to you surprise you in ways you are not prepared for. My husband's name was Franklin Gerald Ostrowski, but everyone called him Frank. He died of a heart attack on a Tuesday in October, which felt wrong somehow. October was always his favorite month. He went quickly, the doctor said, as if that was supposed to comfort me. I held his hand in the hospital room for 2 hours after, because I could not bring myself to let go of something I had been holding for 4 decades. The funeral was on a Friday. My son flew in from Phoenix with his wife, Amber. With his wife, and they stayed in the house, which was fine. That was the right thing. I was grateful not to be alone those first nights. The house is large, 4 bedrooms, more space than 2 people ever really needed. But Frank had insisted when we bought it in 1989 that we would grow into it, and we had. On Sunday evening, when the last of the casseroles had been put away and the sympathy cards were stacked on the mantel, my son sat across from me at the kitchen table and said, "Mom, we need to talk about the house." I looked at him. "It's a lot to maintain on your own," he said. He had the tone he uses when he has already decided something and is now walking me through the logic, so I will arrive at his conclusion. I recognized it. I had been hearing it since he was 19. The property taxes alone, and the upkeep, the yard. "I have a lawn service," I said. "I know, but still." He folded his hands on the table. "Amber and I have been thinking. There's a really beautiful independent living community in Scottsdale. Not a nursing home, nothing like that, just a community of people your age, with activities, support." "I'm 67, I said. "I go to yoga twice a week. I drove myself to the hospital the night your father had his attack." He did not hear me, or rather, he heard me the way people hear things they have already decided not to accept. He kept talking, square footage, resale market, the cost of heating a 4-bedroom house through a Wisconsin winter, the peace of mind it would give them knowing I was somewhere with people around. He said peace of mind 4 times. I counted. I told him I would think about it. That night, I lay in bed in the room I had shared with Frank for 30 years, and I stared at the ceiling, and I thought about a phone call I had received 3 years earlier, on a quiet Wednesday afternoon, from a woman named Roseanne, Frank's younger sister, who had lived in Portugal for the last decade. She had called to tell me that an elderly neighbor of hers had died and left behind a small cottage in the Alentejo region, about 2 hours east of Lisbon. The neighbor had no family in Portugal, and Roseanne was handling the estate informally. She asked if Frank and I had any interest in purchasing it before it went to a local agent. The price was startlingly modest. Frank and I had talked about it over dinner that same night, over a bottle of wine we opened for no real reason, and by dessert we had decided yes. We had bought the cottage quietly. We paid cash from a savings account we had been building for years. Not a secret account, just money we had set aside slowly, vacation money. The kind of thing you accumulate when you are both frugal and patient. We had planned to retire there part of the year. We had told no one. Not because we were hiding anything. We were private people. We liked having something that was just ours. Frank had died before we ever slept a single night in it. I had not mentioned it to my son. After that Sunday kitchen table conversation, I decided I would continue not mentioning it. The weeks that followed were a master class in patience. My son called every other day, always with new information. Scottsdale brochures emailed to my inbox, an article about the difficulty of home maintenance in later life, a statistic about falls in large houses. His wife texted me photos of the independent living community, the pool, the tennis courts, the vibrant social calendar. I responded to everything with the same phrase. That's very thoughtful. I'm still thinking it through. What I was actually doing was calling Roseanne. I had not spoken to Roseanne since Frank's funeral, and even then only briefly, in the receiving line, her hand warm on my arm. But she called me first, actually, about 3 weeks after my son's kitchen table conversation, and we talked for nearly 2 hours. She told me the cottage had been sitting untouched. The local woman Frank and I had hired to keep an eye on it had been maintaining the garden. There was a small leak in the bathroom that had been repaired. The olive trees in the yard were producing. She said in her direct way, "Sylvie, are you going to come?" I said I didn't know. She said Frank would have gone. I sat with that for a long time. In December, my son flew back to Wisconsin for Christmas, and this time the conversation had sharpened. He had done research, he said. He had spoken to a real estate agent. Without asking me, he had spoken to a real estate agent about my house. She believed we could list in spring and get a strong offer within 30 days given the neighborhood. I set down my fork. "You spoke to an agent," I said. "Just exploratory," he said. "Just to understand the market," without mentioning it to me first. He reached across the table and covered my hand with his. "Mom, we just want what's best for you. Dad's gone. You're alone in this enormous house. It's not," he paused. "It's not healthy." I looked at my son's hand on top of mine. I thought about who had taught him to hold a pencil, who had sat with him through 3 weeks of pneumonia when he was 8, who had driven him to soccer practice every Saturday morning for 6 years without once complaining about the early hour. I thought about all of that, and then I very gently removed my hand and picked up my fork again. "I hear you," I said. "Let me think." What I was thinking about was a woman named June, not in my life, but a woman my friend Roberta had told me about years ago. A woman who had been pressured by her adult children into selling her home and moving into assisted living at 64, and who had spent the next decade quietly miserable in 3 rooms while her children redistributed her belongings. I had thought about June occasionally over the years, the way you think about cautionary tales. At a distance, grateful for the distance. Now the distance had collapsed. In January, I called my attorney, a woman I had used for years who I trusted completely. We talked for a long time. We talked about what I owned, what was in my name, what was documented, what my options were. The cottage in Portugal was already in my name. The savings account was mine. The house was mine. None of it required my son's permission or participation to manage. My attorney said gently, "You know you don't have to explain yourself to anyone, right?" I said I knew that. She said, "I just want to make sure you hear it." In February, I booked a flight to Lisbon. I told my son I was visiting a college friend in Florida for 10 days. This was not a lie I felt good about, but it was not a lie I lost sleep over either. I packed a single suitcase, the medium-sized navy one that Frank had bought me for our 25th anniversary trip to Italy, and I drove to the airport on a Tuesday morning in the gray pre-dawn light, and I felt, for the first time since October, like I could breathe. Roseanne picked me up from the Avora bus station in a small, dusty Citroën, wearing enormous sunglasses and a linen shirt, looking like she had lived there her whole life. She hugged me hard and then held me at arm's length and said, "You look tired, Sylvie." I said, "I am tired." She said, "Good. That's what the Alentejo fixes." The cottage was 20 minutes outside of town, down a road that turned to packed dirt after the first kilometer. It was smaller than I had imagined from the photos. A low stone building, whitewashed, with dark green shutters and a terracotta roof, and an olive grove that ran along the left side of the property to a low stone wall. Inside, 3 rooms, clean and simple, terracotta floors, a wood-burning stove, a kitchen with blue tile I had not expected and loved immediately. I stood in the kitchen and I ran my hand along the tile, and I started crying. I had not cried like that since the hospital. Big, ugly crying, the kind you can't control. And Roseanne stood beside me and didn't say anything, just put her hand on my back. And that was exactly right. I stayed for 10 days. I slept 8 hours a night for the first time in months. I walked the olive grove in the mornings. I drove into the village with Roseanne twice a week and bought bread and vegetables and wine and sat in the small cafe on the square and watched the light move across the church facade. I did not check my email. I called my son twice, brief, cheerful calls about Florida weather, and each time I hung up and felt the particular quiet shame of necessary deception. And then I got up and made coffee and sat on the front step and watched the sky turn from gray to orange to blue and decided I could live with it. On the last morning, I sat on the front step with my coffee and my notebook and I wrote down what I wanted, not what was practical or logical or what would give my son peace of mind, just what I wanted. I wanted to spend spring and fall in Portugal. I wanted to keep the Wisconsin house for winters and for visits. I wanted to preserve the right to make my own decisions about my own money and my own life for as long as I was capable of making them. I wanted to not feel ever again like a problem to be solved. I flew home, retrieved my car from long-term parking, and stopped at my attorney's office on the way home from the airport. In March, my son came back to Wisconsin and sat down at my kitchen table and told me that he and his wife had made a decision. They had decided. He used that word, decided, as though it were his decision to make, that the house needed to go on the market by June. He had, he said, already spoken to the agent again. They had a plan. I would move to Scottsdale. They would handle the sale, and the proceeds would be placed in a managed account that would fund the independent living community and leave a remainder for, and here he used a phrase that should have been more surprising than it was, estate planning purposes. I let him finish. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside the window, I could hear the neighbor's dog barking twice and then stopping. The refrigerator hummed. I thought about Roseanne's cafe and the orange light on the church. I want to ask you something, I said. When you say you've decided, what do you mean by that exactly? Because this is my house. Your father and I bought it. It's in my name. I pay the taxes. What is it that you've decided? My son looked at me the way adults look at children who have missed an obvious point. Mom, I'm asking genuinely, I said. Walk me through the legal mechanism by which you have the authority to decide what happens to my house. There was a silence. We're trying to help you, he said finally. His voice had shifted slightly. Something had landed. I know you believe that, I said. I do, and I love you. But I need you to hear me say this clearly. I am not selling the house. I am not moving to Scottsdale. I have already spoken to my attorney, and everything is in order. And I need you to let this go. He stared at me. What does that mean? Everything is in order. It means what it sounds like, I said. He asked more questions. I answered some of them and declined to answer others. I was calm throughout. I had practiced being calm. At one point, his wife, who had been sitting at the other end of the table looking at her phone, said, We're only trying to make sure you're taken care of. And I said, I know, and I am taken care of. I have taken care of it myself. They left the next morning. The goodbye was uncomfortable, stilted, the hug at the door brief and stiff. I stood in the driveway and watched their rental car back out and turn onto the street. And then I went inside and made fresh coffee and stood at the kitchen window, my kitchen window, with my blue mug and my mother's photograph back on the windowsill, and I felt something I had not felt in 6 months. Solid, that's the word. I felt solid. In April, I told my son the truth. Not everything, not yet, but the important part. I told him that I had a property abroad that Frank and I had purchased before he died, that I intended to spend several months a year there, that I had resources he was not aware of, and that I was capable of managing them, and that I needed him to recalibrate his picture of my situation. He was quiet for a long time on the phone. Then he said, Why didn't you tell us? I said, Because you started planning what to do with my house before the funeral flowers had wilted. Another silence. "I'm sorry," he said, and I could hear that he meant it. He is not a bad man. He was afraid, I think. Afraid of losing me the way he'd lost his father. Afraid of not being in control of something that felt uncontrollable. Fear makes people grab. I understand that. I spent 32 years watching adolescents act out of fear and call it something else. I know, I said. I know you are. I flew back to Portugal in May, and I've been here for 6 weeks now. The olive trees are in full leaf. Roseanne came for a long weekend, and we drank wine until 11 on the back terrace and talked about Frank, the real Frank, the funny one, the one who burned toast every single time and never learned. And I laughed for the first time in a long time, and it felt like something unclenching deep in my chest. My son calls on Sundays now. The conversations are easier. He has stopped mentioning Scottsdale. Last week, he asked if they could come visit in September, see the cottage, see where I'm spending my time. I said yes. I said I'd love that. I have not told him what my attorney helped me put in place in March. He doesn't need to know. What he needs to know is that I am healthy and safe and living in a house with blue tile in the kitchen and olive trees outside the window and 30 more years of decisions ahead of me that are entirely, completely mine. Some people will hear this and say I should have been more open from the beginning. Maybe. But I have been a woman in this world for 67 years, and I have learned something that took me a long time to learn and that I want to say plainly, in case anyone listening needs to hear it. Your security is yours to build and yours to protect. The people who love you most are also the people most likely to believe, sincerely and without malice, that they know better than you do what you need. Sometimes they are wrong. And the kindest thing you can do for yourself and for them is to make sure they cannot act on that belief before you have a chance to act on your own. Frank knew this about me. He used to say I was the most quietly stubborn person he had ever met, and he meant it as the highest compliment. I am beginning to think he was right. The coffee is almost gone. The light is coming in through the green shutters at an angle I have started to recognize. Which means it is almost 8, which means Roseanne will be here in an hour with bread from the village bakery, and we will sit on the front step and watch the olive trees do whatever olive trees do in the June morning light, and I will be, without any qualification at all, exactly where I am supposed to be. I have thought a lot about cause and effect since that October Frank died. Not in any cosmic sense, I am too practical for that. But in the plain, observable way that actions produce consequences and silence can be its own kind of action. My son did not become the man who sat at my kitchen table planning the sale of my house because he was cruel. He became that man because for 40 years I had made things easy. I had smoothed edges. I had deferred. I had said, whatever you think is best to Frank, to school administrators, to doctors, to my son. And my son had learned, quietly and without anyone intending it, that the women in his family were manageable, that their lives were problems with solutions he could provide. I had taught him that in the 10,000 small ways we teach people who we are. That is the honest part. The part I had to sit with before I could move forward. What I know now, what those months between Frank's funeral and my flight to Lisbon showed me, is that integrity is not only about telling the truth to others. It is about being honest with yourself first, about what you want, what you have built, what you are owed by the simple fact of having lived a full and careful life. I had spent decades being virtuous in all the visible ways and quietly dishonest in the one way that mattered most. I had pretended, even to myself, that my preferences were negotiable. They were not. They never had been. I just hadn't said so out loud. The decision to stay quiet about Portugal was not born of deception. It was born of wisdom I was only just learning to trust. The understanding that not everything you own needs to be offered up for discussion. That privacy is not the same as secrecy. That a woman who has worked and saved and built a life has the right to hold some of that life in her own 2 hands without explaining herself to anyone. And the resilience, that surprised me most. I had thought of myself for many years as someone who needed consensus to act. Frank had been my sounding board, my second opinion, my reason to delay. Without him, I discovered something I wish I had known at 40. I am steadier alone than I believed. the yoga, the 32 years of teenagers who needed someone calm in the room, the long habit of reading carefully and deciding slowly. All of it had built something in me I had not credited myself with. I walked into my attorney's office and I knew what I wanted. I booked that flight and I did not waver. That was not luck. That was the accumulated result of a life lived with some discipline, finally turned inward where it belonged. Roseanne said something on that first morning at the cottage that I keep coming back to. She handed me my coffee and she said, "Frank always said you were the one who actually knew where you were going. He just liked to drive." I laughed. And then I thought, he was right. I did know. I had always known. I just kept handing someone else the keys. I am not handing them over anymore.